Howdy folks, welcome back to Kdog's Movies. You know, we're right at the beginning of summer, where summer's about ready to take off, and I'm just going to go ahead and just do these movies, at least one of them. But I just wanted to talk about these because somehow I've been thinking a lot about these movies here lately, and I have fun with a coworker of mine where we just sit around and where I quote some like random quote from a movie, and but of course this movie came out during his time, and it's a little past my time. I guess I could have seen it on video, but this was a movie of the 70s, and definitely of the 70s. You could not really make this movie today. But they did do it about... We'll get into that a little bit later, okay? They did do a remake, okay? But yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit later as we go a little bit further into the video. What am I talking about? First of all, I'm going to drop you some hints. Again, 1976. Kids. Baseball. You haven't quite got it yet? It's The Bad News Bears from 1976, released by Paramount. And this is definitely a movie that would not be made, especially this way, at all. You talk about a movie that's totally politically incorrect. It wouldn't... Even the remake, I don't think would be made today, just because of so much of the political correctness junk that's going on. But first, let's get into the story here about what this film is about. Takes place in modern, the 1970s, obviously. Our main character is the guy by the name of Morris Buttermaker. He's played by the legendary Walter Matthau. Well, Morris Buttermaker he was a minor league pitcher that never really made it in the pros. And somehow he ends up, for a living, cleaning pools in Los Angeles. And so he's been paid by this one parent to coach this minor league, this little league baseball team of all these kids that are kind of, let's just say, different. Okay, these kids are, they're the, the type of kids that you would see. These are the kids that they have no skills of playing baseball. They are a little foul-mouthed. They are very, very troublemaking. And they earn their name, the Bad News Bears. And of course, the movie has this... It does have an underdog feel to it, and there's one point in the film where Walter Matthau knows that the team needs help, and so he enlists on the help of a young girl, a 12-year-old girl played by Tatum O'Neal. Her character's name is Amanda Wolitzer, but she's like an insanely great pitcher. But she's wanting to be a girl and grow up as a girl. She doesn't want to do boy things such as play baseball and throw pitches and stuff like that. But he talks her into it, and they start having somewhat success as a ball club. But also they bring in another kid who's kind of causing trouble on the field. He rides his bike throughout his, I don't know what I almost want to say it's a moped. It's not quite a motorcycle, but it's like a moped. He rides his moped through the baseball diamond, and several of the other coaches, they chase the kid off of the field. But Walter Matthau's like, hey, let's give this kid a shot. And he ends up being a big hitter and runner. And so, but yeah, it's a classic movie, and it came around the same time as Rocky did, so people were kind of feeling that underdog thing. And so yeah, you have the kid, but the kids are troublemaker, are a little bratty. They do things that kids should never be doing, but it's you want to root for you want to root for them. They're the good guy. They're really the good guys in the whole thing, and you really do want to cheer for the team by the end of the movie. And of course, Walter Matthau as being this drunken coach in Buttermaker, and that's part of where the comedy is that, you know, he's a little bit of a lush, but it's like he helps them, and the whole thing just bonds together so well. And one person I didn't mention that's in this film is Vic Morrow. Vic Morrow plays the coach of the Yankees, and again, this movie is a perfect example of something that would never be made today. You could not do this. This movie was totally anti-political correctness. I mean, you have a character by the name of, not the name of, but you have a character in the film played by Vic Morrow disciplining one of his kids and just completely berates this kid. And I think at the time, I think that's what kind of led to, when you go to like certain Little League ball diamonds, you see like placards that say he's just a little boy and stuff like that. And you know how tough parents can be on their kids sometimes, and there's stuff like that. But I think it all kind of attributes back to Bad News Bears, really, because based on that scene. I mean, because these kids, the kids do have parents, most of them, but they're just goofy kids. I mean, they're the ones that you would be the last ones to pick for your team. The Bad News Bears from 1976. Another interesting thing is that the screenplay was written by Bill Lancaster. To give you a little bit of who Bill Lancaster is, one of his famous movies that he has also written was not just the Bad News Bears, but he also wrote John Carpenter's The Thing. He wrote the screenplay for that. But Bill Lancaster wrote this. He wrote the character of Morris Buttermaker based on his father. Now, his father is a famous father. Or a famous actor. He's not a famous father, but a famous actor. And that would be Burt Lancaster. Gunfight at the OK Corral, and the most famous thing I remember him from was Field of Dreams, where he played Moonlight Graham. But that one was when he was old and trying to get into heaven. But at the time, Bill Lancaster based Morris Buttermaker on his dad, Burt Lancaster, because he was a little bit grumpy and going through some stuff at the time. Now, this was a runaway hit from 1976. As a matter of fact, Paramount didn't have a lot of faith in the movie when it originally came out, or just prior to release, because they told the director, Michael Ritchie, that you need to have a happy ending, that the Bears need to win the game. And again, this was around the time that Rocky came out, and they realized maybe winning the game isn't the best ending for this movie. The Bears need to tell them to stick it in their ear. And as a matter of fact, the last line in the movie is basically them telling the first placed winners to take the trophy and their apology and stick it where the sun doesn't shine. I'm not going to say it because I kind of want to keep it clean here, but and the movie was rated PG at the time, but again, no PG-13 at this point in time. But it became the runaway hit of 1976, and so that pleased the studio to the point where, hey, we can make some more movies off of this, and so that's what they did. The following year, 1977, we have the Bad News Bears in Breaking Training. It's not called Bad News Bears 2, it's called Bad News Bears Breaking Training. Now, this film's a little bit different. I'm trying to think here. Instead of Walter Matthau here, you have William Devane playing the coach part. Now, in this movie, the Bears apparently have won a championship out in California. That's enough. That gives them enough credibility to take place and compete in a baseball tournament that takes place in Houston, Texas. And so the Bears end up traveling from Los Angeles, California to Houston, Texas, playing in the Astrodome against the Houston Toros. And it gives them a shot for the next film, which I'll get onto. Yeah, it has William Devine as the coach. Supposedly in the store, in between movies, they fired Buttermaker for just being a drunk and a jerk, but this one they go out to the Houston Astrodome and play the game. There's some funny moments in this one too, but some of the other stars we also have Clifton James playing like a, I don't know what he's more like a salesman type of guy. Like, he works for this company and all he does is sit in the stands and drink beer. But yeah, and it's that one's a little bit more heartwarming and a little bit more satisfactory to where they actually do win a game, and they actually do win a game, and you're still cheering for the Bears and so on, but it's just not up to qualities what the first one is, which is but this was typical of sequels. This suffers from what I call sequelitis. But it was popular enough that Paramount said, well, hey, let's go for the third movie, and that's exactly what happened. So in 1978, 76, 77, 78, the Bad News Bears go to Japan. The less said about this, the better. Even though you do have Bill Lancaster coming back to write the screenplay for it, it's not the same. As a matter of fact, in between movies, you lose a little bit of the cast. believe it or not. I mean, Jackie Earle Haley was one of the few that went through, playing the character of Kelly Leak, went through all three films. But the other kid, the kid that played Toby, he's in all three, but he doesn't do much, really. But this one has Tony Curtis as their so adult in the film, and but he's really more of a he's a kind of a reckless promoter and con man, and yeah, it's just, but yeah, it's not the same cast of kids. You're missing the characters of Tanner. You're missing Ogilvy. You're missing some key people, some key kids. You do have the bulk of them returning, but even in the second one, there was a minor change. Not too many people noticed it, but the kid that played Engelberg in this film is not the same kid that played Engelberg in this movie. And the reason being is because the kid that played Engelberg in this film, he was a chubby kid to begin with, but by the time the second one had rolled around, he had lost a bunch of weight. And so Paramount was like, well, we can't have him as Engelberg now, because he had lost too much weight. We now need another chubby kid. And so they replaced him with this other kid, and to take his spot. But yeah, that's the Bad News Bears. And of course, they go to Japan, and if you want to find out what happens in these films, check them out. They are available, believe it or not, in one package, in one collection. So if you poke around on Amazon, you can find, actually in the remake too, you'll find them all four in one box set for a decent price. And they just released the original Bad News Bears on Blu-ray. Now I did check it out. My brother has the Blu-ray version. He brought it over and showed it to me, and the only thing that's really on the Blu-ray is that first of all, it is a better picture transfer, because you're going from standard definition to high definition, but that's minor. The special features is just really people who were influenced by the film, and giving her little 15-minute comments about the film, no less what I'm doing here, but they break it down, scene by scene by scene, their favorite scenes in the film. And one of them is Kevin Smith, filmmaker Kevin Smith. He does a whole spiel about the Bad News Bears, the original. But that being said, moving on, the series didn't end from there. So, in 2005, Paramount decides to remake some classic property. The Bad News Bears was one of those properties. And this was kind of following in a trend that happened within the 2000s, where they were going into the vaults and just really remaking a lot of stuff and doing a lot of sequels to things. But this sounded like a great idea on paper, where you bring in Richard Linklater, who was just coming off the success of School of Rock, which kind of had a Bad News Bears type of vibe to it. Let's be honest. I mean, with Jack Black and teaching the kids how to play rock music and in a prestigious private school. Yeah, it's it kind of had a Bad News Bears type of vibe to it. Because it also had a little bit of an underdog tone to it. And also you have Billy Bob Thornton, who had made a movie called Bad Santa, in which in that film he obviously plays a drunken mall Santa Claus. Okay, so what do? You get both of those guys together and you get this. Yeah. And the big selling point from the director of School of Rock. And I hate to tell you, but this wasn't good. I'm sorry. This is an example of why, of a little bit of political correctness, why the Bad News Bears should never be politically correct. Yeah, you still have Billy Bob Thornton as the alcoholic. You still have the kids swearing a little bit, but and I'm not condoning swearing or anything like that, but there was a charm that came with the original Bad News Bears. This doesn't have it. And what doesn't help is that the original Bad News Bears kind of set the trend of those types of movies that were to follow. Those types of kids' movies. And the problem was when you go to remake that, it gets lost in the shuffle, I think, and it becomes pointless. That was one of the challenges I know that I heard an interview that Steven Spielberg and George Lucas gave when they were going to do Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which we know is not one of the best Indiana Jones movies. Okay, if you're going to watch Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, those are the best two. If you're going to watch any of the four, those two I would stick with. But they said publicly in interviews, they said, we don't know how well this is really going to turn out because many other films, they said that in 1980 or 1981 we set the standard. But then other films came out that reinvented the genre. And it's going to be difficult to compete with those movies. And so, again, with the Bad News Bears, one of the things was they put a little bit of political correctness to it. And it's trying to compete with the films that have come out since then. So you're talking 40 years. Nearly 40 years. This came out in 2005. The Bad News Bears originally came out in 1976. So you're talking nearly 40 years of films that have come out since then that have changed how those movies are made. Okay? And now you want to remake the one that started it all and call it something new and fresh. But I'm sorry, and it's just not the same. It's really not the same. And so that's why I'm kind of against remakes personally. I have no problem with readapting it. Let's say if it's based on a book, I have no problem with you doing another adaptation. Prime example is most recently is It, and how well that movie did. And of course there was a TV miniseries, and some people regard that TV miniseries in such regard, but when the new movie came out, it blew that movie out of the water. And that's possible to do that, but Now, that's a book being readapted. That's not necessarily a remake of the TV movie. That's just another telling of the same source material. But with a movie, it's a different story. If you're remaking a movie, it's really rare that your remake is going to be successful. And I know this turns into a little bit of a rant about remakes, but another example is the Poseidon Adventure. This is an example of, you know, remaking something 40 years before and then trying to compete with stuff that's current. The Poseidon Adventure came out in 1972 with an all-star cast. It was a classic movie for its time. Was very successful film for 20th Century Fox. And then in 2006, Warner Brothers comes out with a remake, just plainly called Poseidon. And again, it also had an all-star cast of people like Emily Rossum, Kurt Russell, what's his name, Josh. Man, I can't think of his name. The guy that was the bad guy in the Hulk, and he's in Secondhand Lot. Josh Lucas. Yeah, I think that's his name. And Richard Dreyfuss was in that film, and it had stuff that would possibly make it work. I personally enjoyed it, but a lot of people didn't, and I see why. It's after seeing both films, you know what? I like the 2006 film, but you know what? That 1972 film was a pretty darn good film as well. But yeah, but that's just a little ramble there about going on about sequels and remakes and stuff like that. But the Bad News Bears, I don't think it was really needed. But, you know, they just thought, hey, here's the School of Rock guy, and he did really well with that. And then here's Bad Santa, you know. Let's get Billy Bob, you know, to play that type of character instead of being a drunken Santa. Let's make him a drunken baseball coach. Yeah. But here's the big difference between this and these is that these were all rated PG. There was no PG-13 at the time, and the PG movie got by with a lot more than what they would today. While the Bad News Bear is just plainly called Bad News Bears, they took out the and Bad News Bears in 2005 again was a little bit politically corrected up, and it got a PG-13 rating. Still, because they still maintain the character of, you know, Morris Buttermaker being a drunk and not being a really good positive influence on those kids. But yeah, I think I'm just going to leave it at that. The Bad News Bears. Check them out. If you haven't seen them, check it out. You know, I'm sure it's on Paramount Plus or definitely on Vudu. If you have that website, you know, have an account, check it out. It's be well worth your time. Do keep in mind that, like I said, it was made back in the 1970s. The original films made back in the 1970s, and so just forewarning you, it's not politically correct. It does have some very harsh language in it, so do be mindful of your little one's ears if they ever see the film. So if I do recommend it, I would say make sure that your kids are at no less the age of 10 when you show it to them. Yeah. So, with that being said, from me to you, see you later.
Together, they turned the Bad News Bears into a team of superstars you will never forget. The Bad News Bears, the incredible story of how a disaster combined with a catastrophe. and somehow became the greatest champs who ever played ball.